How could you have committed this crime from a wheelchair?
I have no lower body function. Physics makes it impossible.
Then why are you resisting my commands?
I'm not resisting. I'm injured and requesting medical aid.
Have you ever tried to convince someone of a truth they absolutely refuse to see? It is a deeply unsettling experience when the evidence is sitting right in front of a person, yet they choose to believe a narrative they fabricated in their own mind. Now, imagine that the person refusing to see reality possesses a badge, a pair of handcuffs, and the authority to strip away your freedom. What happens when the justice system is so blinded by preconceived biases and snap judgments that it fundamentally ignores the basic laws of physics? Today, we are exploring a staggering case of institutional failure. It is a story about how hazardous stereotyping and an absolute refusal to acknowledge visible reality cost a city millions of dollars, ended careers, and left an innocent father bleeding on a cold tile floor. We rely on investigators to uncover the truth, but this narrative asks a chilling question. How do you defend yourself when the investigator has already decided you are guilty before even looking at the evidence? A decade and a half before he ever rolled into that precinct lobby, a life-altering event completely reshaped a young man's reality. He was a towering, athletic individual, spending his evenings guiding high school athletes on the basketball court, teaching them the mechanics of the game. He was also a new father, navigating the sleepless, joyful nights of raising an infant daughter. But on a mundane weekday evening, as he navigated his vehicle through an intersection heading home from a practice session, another driver recklessly ignored a traffic signal. The resulting collision was catastrophic. When he finally regained consciousness in a hospital trauma ward days later, the medical staff delivered the devastating prognosis. His spinal column had sustained irreversible damage at the mid-torso level. The connection was entirely severed. He would never again take a step, nor would he ever experience physical sensation below his ribcage. Rebuilding a life from a seated position requires a monumental amount of mental and physical fortitude. He spent countless grueling months in intensive rehabilitation facilities, learning how to transfer his weight, how to operate a vehicle with specialized hand controls, and how to survive in an architecture that heavily favors those who can walk. His marriage ultimately could not withstand the emotional friction. His spouse quietly harbored growing resentments, and they separated just as their child was learning to speak in full sentences. She retained primary custody, while he maintained regular visitation, never missing a financial support payment and securing a reliable remote position evaluating insurance claims. He even returned to the hardwood, dedicating his weekends to coaching sports for youth facing their own physical challenges, instilling in them the belief that a physical limitation merely alters your approach to a goal. It does not erase the goal itself. He grew accustomed to the daily indignities of a society that often overlooks the disabled. He learned to brush off the misguided pity, the frustrating encounters with buildings lacking ramps, and the strangers who would patronizingly address his companions rather than speaking directly to him. However, absolutely nothing in his 15 years of navigating those societal blind spots could have prepared him for the nightmare his former spouse was about to unleash. In the dead of night, while the ex-wife and their teenage daughter were away visiting relatives, an intruder targeted her residence. The point of entry was brutally straightforward. A solid wooden front door was violently battered inward. The sheer force required to splinter the heavy timber frame and shatter the deadbolt demanded immense lower body strength and the leverage of 2 planted feet. Once inside, the perpetrator ransacked the property and maliciously defaced the interior, spraying vibrant paint across the living room walls at a height reaching nearly 7 feet, an act requiring a tall standing posture or the use of a stepladder. Furthermore, accessing this property was an architectural challenge of its own. The exterior featured a steep elevation, requiring a visitor to ascend a flight of concrete stairs just to reach the front porch. There were no gradual inclines. There were no alternative access routes. Upon returning the following morning and discovering the wreckage, the homeowner contacted emergency services. When a patrol officer arrived to document the devastation, the homeowner did not hesitate to name a suspect. Bypassing any logical assessment of the crime scene, she allowed her lingering bitterness to dictate her narrative. She aggressively pointed the finger at her former husband. She painted a completely fabricated picture of a desperate, resentful man struggling with unseen demons, banking on the hope that authorities would rely on harsh stereotypes rather than investigate the facts. The patrol officer dutifully logged the accusation, though a quiet internal voice noted the glaring physiological contradictions of her claim. Unfortunately, that initial seed of doubt did not transfer to the lead investigator assigned to the file. This detective reviewed the preliminary report and immediately fell victim to a catastrophic anchoring bias. He saw the ex-wife's aggressive statements, absorbed the assumed motives, and permanently locked onto his target. He made the conscious choice to skip the fundamental step of comparing the physical evidence of the shattered door frame to the physical capabilities of his primary suspect. The following afternoon, the investigator contacted the father and requested his presence at the precinct to clarify a few details regarding an incident at his former residence. Knowing he possessed absolute innocence, the father agreed without hesitation. He had nothing to hide, so he saw no need to retain legal counsel for a simple conversation. He navigated his adapted vehicle into a designated parking space, gracefully transferred his upper body into his lightweight manual mobility chair, and glided up the concrete entryway into the bustling, brightly lit public foyer of the police department. He approached the reception glass and announced his arrival. The personnel behind the counter took a long look at him, noted his seated posture, and directed him to a waiting area. Shortly after, the lead investigator stepped out from the administrative wing. The detective observed the man waiting in the mobility device, yet his demeanor remained entirely stoic. He did not escort the suspect to a private, controlled interview room. Instead, displaying a profound lack of professional courtesy, he initiated the confrontation right there in the open lobby, surrounded by waiting citizens, ringing telephones, and multiple high-definition security lenses, silently capturing every frame of the encounter. The detective confidently laid out the severe allegations: a violently breached entryway, stolen property, and heavily vandalized high walls. He explicitly stated that the former spouse had positively identified him as the sole perpetrator. The father listened, his confusion rapidly morphing into sheer disbelief. With a remarkably steady voice, he began explaining the fundamental laws of biology and physics. He gestured to his motionless lower extremities and clearly articulated that his spinal cord had been severed 15 years prior. He calmly detailed how he possessed zero lower body strength to strike a heavy wooden barrier. He explained the impossibility of levitating to deface a ceiling. He pointed out the undisputed fact that he could not even navigate the steep concrete steps leading to the porch in the first place. The investigator's reaction was not one of realization, but of aggressive defensiveness. Refusing to admit his own flawed logic, the detective doubled down, sternly declaring that occupying a mobility device did not grant automatic immunity from criminal behavior. He cynically suggested that he had witnessed individuals fabricate physical limitations to avoid consequences. The sheer audacity of the statement left the father momentarily speechless. He offered to provide extensive medical documentation, magnetic resonance imaging scans, and surgical records verifying a complete severing of his nervous system. Instead of pausing the interview to verify these easily obtainable facts, the investigator spun a wild, baseless conspiracy theory, suggesting the father must have orchestrated the break-in, perhaps directing an unseen accomplice while watching from the sidewalk. The father's frustration finally broke through his calm exterior. He realized he was not speaking to an investigator searching for the truth. He was speaking to an authority figure desperately trying to bend reality to fit a preconceived narrative. The detective had looked at an innocent man, applied a filter of hazardous stereotyping, and decided that the undeniable physical evidence of the wheelchair was simply an inconvenience to his case. Without presenting a single shred of corroborating physical evidence, the detective announced to the crowded room that he was initiating an official arrest for felony property crimes. The father demanded to know how this was legally permissible. He pointed out his airtight physical alibi, his own paralyzed body. Ignoring the protests, the investigator retrieved a pair of metal restraints, positioned himself aggressively behind the mobility chair, and barked a command for the suspect to twist his arms backward. The father attempted to explain the mechanics of his balance. A person utilizing a manual chair relies entirely on their upper body tension and hand placement on the wheels to maintain a stable center of gravity. Twisting backward without support is inherently dangerous. The investigator disregarded the warning entirely. Reaching down, he forcefully gripped the father's wrists and violently wrenched them backward and upward to apply the cuffs. The physical reaction was instantaneous and inevitable. With his arms pinned behind him, the man's center of mass was thrown violently over the front casters. The lightweight frame of the chair buckled under the shifting momentum, tipping sharply forward. The father plummeted face first toward the unforgiving commercial flooring. Unable to extend his hands to break the fall, his skull cracked sickeningly against the concrete tile, followed immediately by the heavy impact of his shoulder and ribcage. The air was driven from his lungs. He lay entirely marooned in the center of the precinct, his arms locked behind his back, his motionless legs tangled in the overturned metal frame. Above him, the detective calmly secured the locking mechanisms, completing the arrest as if he hadn't just severely injured a vulnerable citizen in broad daylight. What followed is a profound study in the toxic nature of institutional complacency and the bystander effect. The father's head throbbed intensely, warm blood pooling near his temple. His chest burned with what felt like fractured bones, but the most terrifying sensation was the absolute lack of feeling below his ribcage. He knew his upper body was battered, but he had no neurological way of knowing if his pelvis was shattered or if his femurs had snapped during the violent tumble. Panic began to set in. He raised his voice, desperately calling out for medical triage. He explained the terrifying reality of his sensory loss. The investigator, displaying an astonishing lack of humanity, merely scolded the man for failing to cooperate with the restraining process. When the father begged a nearby uniformed colleague for assistance in righting his chair, that officer remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a silent, unwritten code that demanded unwavering loyalty to a superior, even in the face of blatant cruelty. The lead detective callously turned his back on the bleeding man, strolling over to the reception counter to complete administrative paperwork. He casually remarked over his shoulder that if the suspect was incapable of picking himself off the linoleum, perhaps his ability to commit the property crime was equally suspect. The father shouted back that this was the exact biological reality he had been trying to explain for the past 20 minutes. And then the waiting began. Time stretches into an agonizing eternity when you are trapped, injured, and stripped of your basic dignity. Minutes ticked by. He loudly and clearly invoked his federally protected civil rights, demanding the reasonable accommodations required by law for individuals navigating physical limitations. He warned them of a suspected traumatic brain injury, citing severe nausea and vertigo. The detective casually promised a consultation with a facility nurse only after the booking documents were processed. Uniformed personnel walked past the gruesome scene, their eyes carefully averted. Citizens arriving to file routine reports cautiously stepped around the tangled man and his overturned chair, implicitly trusting that the authorities must have a justifiable reason for leaving a bleeding citizen discarded on the ground. For nearly 20 agonizing minutes, the precinct lobby operated with chilling normalcy around a glaring human rights violation. The cycle of indifference was finally shattered when the heavy doors of the executive wing swung open. The newly appointed precinct commander, a leader specifically brought in by the city to eradicate a deeply entrenched culture of misconduct, stepped into the foyer. She stopped dead in her tracks. The scene before her was incomprehensible. A citizen lay bound and bleeding on the floor, an overturned mobility device beside him, while her staff casually filed paperwork and monitored the reception desk. Her voice echoed through the high ceilings, demanding immediate answers. The lead investigator casually attempted to justify the situation as a standard booking procedure following a slip. The commander ignored him, rushing to the injured man's side. The father, his voice now weak and trembling, explained his paralysis, his head trauma, and the excruciating timeline of his abandonment. Rising to her feet, the commander's demeanor shifted from shock to absolute fury. She bypassed all procedural pleasantries, issuing a direct, uncompromising order to remove the restraints and right the citizen immediately. The detective and the complicit officer awkwardly hauled the man back into his seat, their rough handling exposing a glaring lack of basic accessibility training. The commander immediately dispatched emergency medical technicians. While they waited for the sirens to arrive, she asked the father to recount the events. He delivered the absurd narrative. Accused of splintering a solid door, accused of painting high walls, arrested despite lacking the physiological ability to execute a single element of the crime. The commander turned her piercing gaze to her investigator, asking a series of devastatingly simple questions. Did you inspect the crime scene? Yes. Did it require the use of standing leg power? Yes. Does the suspect possess the use of his legs? No. Did you review his medical history? No. Did you verify if the residence was physically accessible without stairs? No. The detective stood speechless, his entire foundation of assumptions crumbling under the weight of basic, undeniable logic. The commander did not hesitate. She stripped both officers of their authority right there in the lobby, suspending them pending a massive internal review and promising them that a catastrophic legal reckoning was imminent. The medical personnel arrived, confirming the concussion, applying sutures to the lacerated temple, and diagnosing severe trauma to the rib cage. After the ambulance departed, the commander personally reviewed the security footage. She watched the entire horrific sequence unfold in high definition. She saw the absolute disregard for human life. She immediately contacted the municipal attorneys, advising them to prepare for an indefensible civil rights lawsuit. She then placed a call to the ex-wife, informing her that her malicious, fabricated narrative had resulted in severe physical trauma to an innocent man, and that she should prepare to face her own severe legal consequences for initiating a fraudulent police response. The subsequent legal battle was swift and completely uncompromising. The father's legal team filed a massive federal lawsuit citing unlawful detention, severe violations of disability protections, excessive force, deliberate indifference to acute medical distress, and the devastating impact of hazardous stereotyping. The evidence was insurmountable. The surveillance footage leaked to the public, igniting outrage across the nation. Millions watched the chilling reality of an investigator stating that a mobility device was merely a prop to hide behind. Expert witnesses systematically dismantled the investigator's defense. Neurological specialists testified that a mid-torso spinal separation rendered the alleged property damage physically impossible. It was akin to accusing a completely visually impaired individual of executing a complex color-coded art heist. Architectural experts confirmed the residence was an impenetrable fortress for anyone utilizing wheels instead of feet. Legal scholars pointed out that ignoring a direct request for emergency medical aid following a head impact was a blatant constitutional violation. But the most damning moment occurred during the sworn depositions, when pressured by the legal team to explain why he proceeded with an arrest that defied the laws of physics. The disgraced detective could offer no rational defense. When asked if he simply possessed too much ego to admit he had aggressively cornered the wrong citizen, The silence that filled the courtroom spoke volumes. The municipal government capitulated before a jury could even return from deliberations. A historic 8-figure financial settlement was reached, but the monetary compensation was only a fraction of the victory. The lead investigator was permanently stripped of his law enforcement credentials, rendering him unemployable in the field and forcing him to pay a substantial personal penalty. The complicit bystander officer faced heavy suspensions and a permanent stain on his professional record. The former spouse was utterly bankrupted by a separate civil judgment and subsequently lost all custodial rights to her daughter after a family court judge determined her vindictive, biased assumptions created a toxic and dangerous environment. The precinct commander utilized the undeniable tragedy to spearhead sweeping, systemic overhauls. Mandatory, rigorous training on disability accommodations became a requirement for every sworn officer. Strict new protocols demanded that investigators empirically verify a suspect's physical capability to commit a specific act before ever reaching for their restraints. State legislators codified these protections into law, ensuring that a glaring physical impossibility could never again be brushed aside by an investigator's ego. As for the father, he took the horrific indignity he suffered on that cold tile floor and transformed it into a shield for others. He established a heavily funded foundation dedicated to providing elite legal representation for vulnerable individuals facing institutional discrimination. He secured full custody of his daughter, continuing to guide her toward a bright collegiate future, and he continued to patrol the sidelines of the basketball court, teaching resilience to a new generation. When he occasionally addresses lawmakers and newly recruited cadets, his message pierces right to the core of the issue. He reminds them that for nearly 20 minutes, he was rendered entirely invisible, not because the people in that room lacked the physical ability to assist him, but because they had collectively decided, based on deeply entrenched biases, that his reality did not matter. They saw a narrative they had constructed in their minds, rather than the broken, bleeding human being lying right at their feet. We entrust our institutions with immense power, operating on the fundamental belief that they will prioritize objective facts over dangerous assumptions. But when those in authority refuse to look past their own preconceived notions, the truth becomes a casualty, and innocent lives are shattered. It shouldn't take a historic legal settlement and viral surveillance footage to prove that the laws of gravity, biology, and basic human dignity apply to everyone. What steps do you believe communities need to take to completely eradicate this kind of dangerous institutional blindness before it destroys another life? Let us know your thoughts in the discussion below. And if you believe that undeniable physical evidence should always outweigh a detective's assumptions, make sure to engage with the channel to help spread this critical message.